Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm looking into the subject of academic ethics and integrity. So think topics like exam cheating, plagiarism, and the ethical decision-making that go into research programs. Dr Sarah Eaton is from the University of Calgary in Canada, where she specialises in academic integrity, which includes topics like plagiarism. In my conversation with her, we look at how remote learning is transforming education and the challenges it poses. We dive specifically into the area of exam cheating, which of course is that much easier when you're being tested remotely, and what can be done about it. I wanted to look at this topic because coronavirus has exposed particular challenges for the education sector, notably universities whose business models are under pressure, and schools, of course, who've had to adapt to the new way of doing things. Now, we're all impacted by the sector, whether that's because we've got kids in education, we're in it ourselves, or we once upon a time went to school or university. And of course, the education sector is playing a key role in responding to coronavirus. We need the scientists, including the behavioural ones, to help get us out of COVID. And as we discover in our discussion, many of the techniques that are used in adult education, including the way companies train and educate their staff, are based on the models in use in academia. What doesn't work quite so well in that environment is also potentially not so good in a corporate one. What Sarah had to say was fascinating. We talk about everything from the origins of exams to the Nuremberg trials. And if, like me, you've not taken an exam in years, you might be intrigued to learn about some of the techniques being used to cheat and what countermeasures exist. Stand by for an education in education, and please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Sarah Eaton. So Sarah, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you for the invitation to join you.
It's my absolute pleasure. And look, before we start talking about the sort of subject of education and some of the dynamics that we're seeing, I thought it might be nice to get an idea from you as to how you found your chosen specialism and what interests you about it.
Yeah, so I work in education. My field of study is educational leadership policy and governance. So I came to this work through higher ed policy, looking at academic misconduct policies in Canada and internationally. That led into some broader work around academic integrity and educational ethics. And then by extension, which is a broad field, the link between educational integrity in classrooms and applied ethics in workplaces and society at large.
What do we mean by academic ethics?
Academic ethics, it can vary a little bit. There's no universally agreed upon definition, right? So typically we'll talk about academic integrity, which in particular pertains to higher education. In the UK, for example, the Quality Assurance Agency that oversees quality assurance in higher ed will incorporate academic integrity as one of its quality assurance criteria. We don't have a national body here in Canada that looks at quality assurance of higher education, but every higher ed institution, post-secondary, is concerned with academic misconduct, cheating, plagiarism, those kinds of behaviors. What does that mean? What does that look like? Educational ethics also includes things like research integrity and leadership integrity, institutional integrity, auditing integrity. So it's the idea of ethical leadership and ethical conduct within educational organizations and the education system at large.
We're seeing a huge shift at the moment in, given the sort of lockdown situation, we're seeing a huge shift in the way education is being delivered. Can you talk a little bit around the challenges that poses with regard to sort of some of the ethical pieces?
It's fascinating, right? Because we've got this transition to online. We're calling it online. It's really remote learning. I mean, I've been teaching online for over a decade now. What is happening currently is nothing like what happens in online learning generally for people who've been trained to deliver courses online. We understand some of the principles behind online learning. What we've seen in this massive rapid shift to remote teaching is really a crisis response to help the students stay in school during this pandemic, right? And ensure that they can continue to not only just learn, but also work towards whatever credentials or diplomas that they were working towards, even if it's just passing a grade in, say, elementary school. So this shift is unprecedented, I think, in human history in terms of the rate of change that we've seen in how education providers are delivering education to students, not only at elementary, secondary levels, tertiary levels, in industry. I mean, everything about training and education has changed massively in a short period of time. This is really unprecedented any other time we've had before.
And obviously there's the logistical challenges. I mean, literally of how do you suddenly transition an experience, a physical experience, if you like, into one that is 100% digital and, making that happen. But there's clearly a huge shift in terms of the from the perspective of this isn't just sort of moving something to a different location. There are whole processes geared up. And if I think about the sciences, for example, you are no longer able to visit your laboratory. So how does one handle that piece?
Yeah, and I don't think we have any clear answers around that, right? I think that, in the disciplines where, lab work is required or hands-on work is required, the trades as well, their learning has been disrupted in ways that I think no one could have imagined before, right? It could have been, talking with educators here, lots of people have said, I can't do this work online. And the idea of how do you teach, as you said, things that happen in a lab, engineering courses, hands-on courses, things in the trade, kinesiology, veterinary medicine, hands-on medicine, those things require some interaction either with lab materials or other humans or animals or something other than books. I think that the people who work in humanities and education have really had it easy.
No, well, I was just imagining if sort of students took it upon themselves to build their own laboratories at home, the potential consequences of that are probably not worth thinking about. But and what does that mean from an ethical perspective? So what are some of the dynamics that you're having to consider now on top of the traditional ones? And are there ethical, sort of subsidiary question, are there ethical issues that dissipate whilst others increase?
Yes, the short answer to your question is yes. I teach in education, right? So I don't deal with hands-on lab work, but I do consult with my colleagues in the sciences. We've been consulting a lot around academic integrity issues. And some of them have just said they just don't know how to do the work. So some labs, for example, some schools that canceled labs altogether. Some have tried to move them virtually. Some have tried to move to YouTube videos or other kinds of online videos. There are some schools, open universities and open learning, where everything has been done in remote context for a long time. But for an educator who's been trained to do hands-on work somehow, this shift is breaking their brains. People are trying to really struggling of how do I support my learners to do this? I heard everything from labs are canceled to I'm going to do a couple of recorded lectures, and that's how we'll end our term, to we're going to try and do something makeshift. I'll demo something. You can watch it in real time in your video conferencing software. Or it's just people are trying to hack education, I think, to try and figure out how to do this with no training and no background. And in terms of ethics, what does this mean for student learning? Certain kinds of learning do require hands-on learning. So can people learn ethically if they can't learn in ways that make sense for the discipline? That's a question we have yet to answer in education.
And one of the areas that I found really intriguing is the idea of sort of cheating, for want of a better phrase. And so I saw a tweet that somebody had suggested, and it's not clear to me this is actually happened, but I'll put it to you as a sort of hypothetical to see what you think, which was this idea that because pupils can cheat on exams that are taken remotely, that one professor, it was suggested, had set a question that was impossible to answer. And therefore, and what he had done is set that question, and then on a well-known exam cheating website, I'm showing my age here because I didn't really think those were things, but clearly they are. It makes a lot of sense. He had posted a theoretical answer to this unanswerable question that was, of course, wrong. And his proposal was that anybody that came back with that standard answer would then face disciplinary sanctions. And I thought that was a really interesting ethical question, because on the one hand, you do want to put some controls in place to make sure people can't cheat. On the other hand, that screamed entrapment and inappropriateness, and therefore I wasn't comfortable with the solution. But I saw the problem that was there.
You're absolutely right in that it is an ethical conundrum that is worthy of academic study. In terms of teaching practice, I've heard about that case, and like you, I don't know whether or not it's true. If it's true, I think it's horrific because online, assessment practices, poor assessment of practices, don't make up for or any way an answer to academic misconduct or cheating. Right? When I heard about that alleged incident, what came to mind for me? First of all, I mean, Star Trek fans will appreciate this: the notion of the Kobayashi Maru, right? The idea of an unsolvable problem that no one's been ever to solve this, and of course young Captain Kirk goes in and recreates the rules. But the idea of posting a wrong answer to a file sharing site is reprehensible because it is an act of entrapment on the part of the instructor. Yes, these file sharing sites and test answering sites are not only do they exist, they're prolific across the world, every discipline. There is no discipline that is exempt from having test answers posted on file sharing sites. It's one of the things that when I talk with colleagues here about, they say, no, that doesn't exist. I'm like, well, it might not have existed on the internet when you were a student, but it certainly exists now. And there's millions and millions, if not tens of millions of test answers posted on these websites, and students go in, they pay a small fee and they download the test answers, or they download to, do some file sharing. And it's every school. There's no topic, no subject that is immune to this. And so what the teacher knew, it is entrapment because the teacher had to have an idea what sites his students would go to. There are literally hundreds of these file sharing sites, right? So he would have had to create an account, he or she, let's say they would have had to create an account, go in, pose as somebody, probably a student, posting an answer that they supposedly had gotten in an illicit way, post the wrong answer so that they then knew their students would probably go to one of these file sharing sites. And there are numerous. There's a few sort of big players out there, but might have already known that the students were using this site and not addressed it in class or not addressed it with the school administration. So how the alleged instructor knew to go to a particular site is a puzzling question. But then to post the answers and plant this evidence, this yes, you said entrapment evidence, completely unethical, because the purpose of doing so was only to catch students who had gone onto the site, or sometimes what happens, we know, is that there is one student who will go on and pay the fee and then will download answers and then distribute those answers to their classmate. So it's not that all students necessarily go on to the file sharing site. It only takes one, and then you drop the answers into, say, a shared online folder or a social media sharing site. Students use those a lot. And then the answers are posted there. So the professor knew what they were doing was wrong. And by they, I mean the individual instructor here. They knew that it was wrong, and they did it anyway. They did it for the purposes of catching students. They're starting with the idea that students are doing something wrong. They're starting with guilty until proven innocent, which is educators, hugely problematic.
Right, and I was giggling as you were talking because there were several things I wanted to pick out. The first that amused me was this idea that if you've bought an answer from one of these sites, presumably the terms and conditions of the sites preclude you from sharing it with other people because that's effectively sharing a login. So there's an ethical question as to whether that's appropriate. But I'm guessing if you're going onto one of these sites, you've probably parked some of those considerations. But I mean, it's a really interesting pick because I understand the problem. And, as I say, it horrifies me in a way that they're so prolific, and yet it's perfectly logical. Wouldn't take a genius to work out that somebody would go, here is a problem that needs fixing, and I'm going to come and provide that solution for it because I can. What is the solution to this? I guess generally in terms of the proliferation, but particularly now, if it really is as bad as you suggest.
I think part of the problem rests with us as educators and professors because we're still assessing our students in 20th century ways. We continue to propagate the test-taking techniques and assessment design strategies that were used on us when we were students. Many of us, are middle-aged now, so we grew up and were schooled during the 20th century. And many of us, and I say this inclusively as educators, we haven't caught up to the 21st century, right? So many of my colleagues were not taking tests at the time when Napster came out. I mean, Napster in its original form is long gone now, but the idea of the file sharing, whether it's music, entertainment, tests, that's literally been around for 2 decades. And so many professors remain oblivious to these file sharing sites that are worth, tens of millions of dollars. And we literally have our heads buried in the sand. We haven't caught up with the 21st century. We don't, we largely, by and large, we academics refuse to acknowledge that the way students learn in the 21st century is fundamentally different than the ways in which we learned. Really, you don't need to memorize anything anymore because the answers are all on the internet. You can Google anything in seconds, right? So asking students what they know is kind of useless. More appropriate, more useful is asking, how do you know it? And how would you apply it? And how is this relevant to your discipline or your work or your industry? The how is way more important today than the what. As
you were talking, it's perfect. And I recall Napster, though clearly I'm not the sort of person who would ever have used that under any circumstances, but I'm aware of how it operated.
None of us are.
And but other people have told me about it. But it's interesting when you put it in that context and you sort of say it is kind of obvious that the technology exists, two, the propensity to use it exists, and three, there is clearly a need if you put students under pressure. So all of those things make perfect sense. But I can sort of see how one doesn't feel one needs to adjust with the times, because you can sort of say that academia, there's competition in academia, but in many respects, people are coming in and sort of, the system is what it is. And if you like the school and you like the course, then the way that they choose to examine it isn't something that you're going to be too selective around, probably, because you're interested in what you're learning rather than the way they test it. Or at least I wasn't particularly focused on the way that. And so you could sort of say, well, it's understandable that though the dynamic you've described of being stuck in the 20th century, in some respects, is not surprising. On the other hand, when you look at the academic disbenefit of cleaving to those old ways, that's a huge gap. I mean, it's fascinating and sort of astonishing that we haven't moved.
Yeah, it kind of is, right? Especially when so many universities and other post-secondary institutions tout that they're innovative and they're cutting edge and they're on the brink of like new discoveries all the time. And yet we continue to do things like administer multiple choice tests to students. Clearly, multiple choice tests aren't innovative.
No, they've been around for some time. This is true.
Mm-hmm. And really, I mean, I think in some ways, instructors make the decision around how to assess, around how is it easy to mark. They're not really interested in how students are learning or what they're learning. They're interested in tests that are easy to mark, right? So taking those multiple choice exams and running them through a Scantron machine, again, still 20th century technology, but continues to be used today in many institutions. Instructors, by and large, are often overstressed. They've got more on their plate than they can handle in a given day with the amount of content they have to teach. And the idea of actually having to mark an assessment in which students are explaining how they've learned something is overwhelming, because it takes a lot longer to grade those assignments or those tests.
And there's greater risk associated, right? Because your multiple choice is what it is, and there's no fine. You can question whether the way the question was phrased is appropriate, but from a mark perspective, what you get out of that test is defensible decision making. From an exam set. At the moment you start bringing judgment in, that's opening you to risk, I guess, and people's complaints about things, and it's a lot more work, as you say.
It is a lot more work. And yes, it's subject to judgment, but isn't ethical conduct in the workplace as part of a judgment call that we make on a daily basis? Aren't those ethical decisions that we make every day on the job and in life part of our judgment? And if we're going to tell students that they need to develop their critical thinking skills, or we need to tell teachers to teach critical thinking skills, but educators aren't willing to use their own critical thinking skills for fear that they'll be challenged, or that someone will come back and appeal a grade. That's quite a paradox, right? That we think that critical thinking skills and analytical skills and judgment skills, ethical decision making are all important, and yet we want to assess in ways that don't involve any of those skills.
So, and actually, I was struck. There's a real parallel between what you described and the way many organizations do kind of compliance or code of conduct type stuff, where it's we need to do this. We need to be seen to be doing this. We're going to put people through a test. And so, in the banking industry, which is my former industry, you get sort of questions in a multiple choice that are utterly irrelevant. So, for example, a question would be: failure to comply with this rule will result in 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years in jail. as if the difference between those things is of any consequence whatsoever. And you're right, the driving force behind the question is, what is it easy for us to mark? And how can we tick a box? And we've asked the question. It is absolutely irrelevant to the person taking that test, which are the answers. And I don't want people sitting there arbitraging between 5 years and 15 years in jail, because if that's genuinely their thought process, we got other problems. But I think this idea of doing things that's convenient for the tester and isn't testing is more widespread than education. But it may well be that organizations take their lead from education, and that the people setting those tests in organizations kind of remember back to stuff they saw from education, the last reference point they have for this type of exercise, and borrow from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've raised a really good point. And the question that's coming into my mind as you're talking about this is compliance antithetical to critical thinking? Right? If we're just concerned with ticking boxes, people aren't actually thinking through their actions. They're only concerned with ticking the box. So I'm wondering if in that moment, are we actually saying, don't use your critical thinking skills? I mean, there's a really big question there, right? I mean, around compliance and box ticking and making sure we've done all the right things. I mean, when we look at sort of box ticking, if you will, in academic misconduct case, we need to know that, there's been procedural fairness. That's been part of the case, and there's a lot of box ticking. But when we do that, we lose the conversation entirely around learning. Right? At that point, nobody is actually caring anymore if the student has learned anything, because we're so bloody busy ticking boxes that we forgot the human aspect of it all.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that question from a compliance perspective is it depends, as most answers to complex questions are. But I would say there are certain situations in life where you don't want anybody exercising any form of judgment whatsoever around a thing. So procedures in an operating theatre, there are going to be a heck of a lot of things where you don't want anyone exercising any creativity whatsoever. Maintaining an aircraft, I want you to strictly follow. All of that said, even with those things, you do want people to think outside the box a little bit and go, okay, I mustn't screw the nut on the wrong way, or inject this person with this thing without following procedure. But actually, if something weird happens outside that, I shouldn't just slavishly follow the rules and think that that's okay. So, yeah, even in those incredibly sort of disciplined where checklists make sense scenarios, even there, you do want people to be alive to what is going on and to pay attention to their surroundings. So I think you're right. The moment, if the test becomes demonstrate your ability to slavishly follow a set of rules, then the reality of what you're teaching people to do, or at least telling them that you think is important, is precisely that slavish following. And that's not great in the 21st century where we have so many dynamics of things that can go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's based on industrialist models of education where children were literally being trained to work in factories, right? And they weren't being educated to do anything more than that, because that was sort of their lot in life. And in many ways, those industrialist models of education continue to be propagated in and beyond schools.
How does our mythical, and the more you talk, the more I'm thinking this must be a mythical case, right? No one would be that idiotic to go down that road. But hey, I always allow the possibility that people. But if we look at that hypothetical case, I mean, what is the solution then for these academic challenge of sort of it's not fit for purpose in the way that you've outlined, but equally the risk of them cheating exists?
Well, sure. The risk of student cheating dates back to, it's been documented since the 6th century, right? Back in when the original exams were sort of designed. And we can trace cheating back that far because that was sort of the origin of exams. So that in a way, this is indicative of human behavior. And we know that cheating behaviors can be exacerbated by conditions or context. So, for example, there's the thing that we call the cheat to compete syndrome. So students feel that they need to get high grades because of parental pressure, other pressures. They may feel that the only way they can achieve those or compete with their peers is to cheat. That's one phenomenon. These are pointing to larger societal pressures, familiar pressures on students. And I think one of the pieces that's been lost in this conversation is the context in which students are trying to learn today we talked a little bit about that shift to remote teaching. There's also been a shift to remote learning. And students are trying to learn in the middle of a global pandemic. They weren't trained in how to learn under these conditions. So we're putting them under extraordinary stress to perform under conditions that they've never experienced before. So they haven't had any chance to practice. What is it like to take a test in pandemic conditions? very few of our learners would have had any opportunity to experience that, right? And yet we're sticking them into these conditions in remote learning. And many of us, I think, as educators, are forgetting that students also are experiencing this as a global pandemic, and they've largely been left out of the conversation in that regard.
That's really interesting, because I was watching there was a German government minister who was, and you know, to be clear, they've handled the pandemic situation as well as I think pretty much any country. But he was very much saying, look, effectively saying we do not want to have some kind of grade inflation with our exams, right? So just because you are taking exams in Corona time, and I'm paraphrasing hugely here, we shouldn't cut you any slack. And I was listening to that message and thinking, yeah. You know, why should we shouldn't make it any easier? Partly because we don't want to stigmatize people. You know, oh, you only got that grade because you were taking it in 2020. You know, had normal standards applied, you would have been much worse off. And so I can see the logic but you're absolutely right from a student's perspective. I mean, we are all struggling in our own ways, and some people are pretending not to be struggling, but we're all struggling in our own ways to adapt to this piece. And the pressure of exams is massive. So to sort of ladle two things on, that's a really interesting bit. What is the solution there? I mean, I guess one thing you could do is to say, well, we just freeze time and we don't continue the normal machine, but that has knock-on consequences.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is a single answer to this, right? And as you're talking, I mean, I do think that you're quite a bit further ahead in Europe than we are in North America with the question around grade inflation. We've yet to enter into that conversation in any meaningful way. And when we do, I hope that we'll be following in your footsteps in the ways that we're addressing it. But it does sort of bring to light for me that this shift to remote teaching and learning that we've been talking about, we sort of talk about it in general globalized terms, right? And one of the conversations we've been having here in Canada that I don't know if you're having in Europe or not, is around students living in rural areas. And remote learning, we've got students in remote areas. I mean, Canada's a huge, vast country. Some of our country does not yet have internet service. Right. And some of our students, although they may have been studying in urban areas before the pandemic, when they all left campuses to go to their homes, some of them may have gone to areas without a stable internet connection. And so connectivity has become a big conversation here around equity and access to education and learning during the remote shift, because if a student is living in an area without adequate access to connectivity or internet, because the infrastructure isn't existing in their community yet, how can you ask that student to take a test, say, and maybe be proctored by an e-proctoring service that requires a video camera to take their video, or even take an online test when they don't have access to connectivity? So this question around remote learning, I think, needs to be localized to some extent and take into consideration not only national learning contexts, but also local or regional learning contexts and things like connectivity, access to the internet, and even students' own access to technology, right? One of the things that surfaced through all of this is not all students have a laptop at home, at least not in all of the developed countries. There seems to be this assumption that, yeah, students, they all have their phones, they all have computers, and we're realizing that actually some of them don't. They rely on the publicly available computers on campus, for example, or at schools. And they might have a webcam. And so we've made all of these huge assumptions about how students can learn. And the reality is that not all of them have that access to technology. So the social justice issues around how we're implementing this learning are coming to light. And certainly if you're having like a timed exam, I could imagine this as well for compliance exams in industry, for example. You've got a particular start time and end time. If someone's internet goes down, or say their electricity goes out before or during the exam, how can they be held responsible for the results?
Right. It's really interesting. And of course, because we're making it up as we go along, and that's not a criticism of the thing. I mean, I think every society is making it up as we go along with certain exceptions. Yeah, that's going to be tough because that's not something you would naturally think of up front. And even if you did have the work, how do you solve that? Because that's not just an education problem.
No,
that's an infrastructure, societal challenge.
Yeah, it does. It poses huge ethical risk, right? And it's also something it's a variable we can't control. So if my internet were to go down in the middle of this podcast, then we would need to try and reconnect and,
Right.
start the interview again, sort of thing. The same thing is happening to thousands of students every day who are taking their tests in online environments, that their internet is going down even for just a moment, or they're getting booted off, or their electricity is going down. And we can't account for that variable.
Right. I was giggling because it reminded me of the sort of dog ate my homework type excuses that, again, not me, but, some of my peers at school would have come up with to sort of get around things. And so there's two sides to this, because on the one hand, if you were a sort of minded to be lazy or devious, this offers a whole host of excuses for non-completion of things and kind of cutting corners and cheating being one of those dynamics. But you're absolutely right. There are legitimate people who are going to struggle as a result of it. So it's interesting how you manage the risks at both ends, which is you need to have the inclusiveness piece, but that runs greater risk of nefarious behavior and certain other aspects. I mean, this is a real challenge.
Yeah, I agree, right? I mean, yes, I couldn't agree more. And we know, of course, that there's a small percentage of the population who will always cheat. And we know that there's a small percentage of the population who will never cheat. But along that bell curve, there's a great majority of people that might be tempted to make poor decisions, dependent on the context in which they find themselves, who they think is watching, all of those, different variables. Most people will not fall at either end of that bell curve, but somewhere in the middle.
Right. So influenceable either way, I guess, or to a degradation of pieces. And have you got any sense of sort of, and again, maybe too early to say, of sort of a shift in people, students' perceptions of education throughout this? Are they looking at it differently in terms of their propensity to cheat or their diligence, that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, right? And what I've heard in my circles is sort of an assumption that when learning moves online, cheating increases. And in fact, there's 20 years of research to show that is not the case, that there is not more cheating that happens in online courses. However, cheating may happen differently. So what you might see is an increase in the use of unauthorized materials, what we might call cheat sheets or crib notes or online file sharing sites, that kind of thing. There's also an increase in impersonation. So somebody hiring a student to either take a course on their behalf, take an exam on their behalf, or complete academic work or other work on their behalf. So those are the two kinds of behaviors that we see an increase in online courses, but that doesn't necessarily equate to an overall increase in the rates of misconduct. So for example, in face-to-face classes, there's a lot more sharing between students. Can I look at your paper? Can I borrow your homework? The kind of collusion or unauthorized sharing happens less in online courses generally. So there are some myths to be busted around the rates of cheating in online courses.
And the way you were depicting it sounded like it was just simply a displacement. So, what goes on in the physical environment it just happens in a different form in the digital one and manifests itself in different ways. But it doesn't sound like attitudes massively change across swathes of pupils.
No, I mean, in the research that I've been reading, the one predictor of cheating that might be different in online courses is with younger students. So we know that first-year uni students are at a higher risk, for example, of making poor ethical decisions than their peers in their senior years of their program. And part of that has been attributed, we can't be cause and effect, but it's been attributed to the development of moral conduct and ethical decision-making that happens with young people sort of between the ages of 18 and 30, right? That people don't arrive to university knowing all of the rules of academic integrity, they become acculturated to the expectations of education, of ethical conduct in higher ed, which then leads to an understanding of ethical conduct beyond higher ed as they're moving through their post-secondary training.
Is that a function of just the development stage of people, or is that a failing in education at an earlier stage? Because I'm intrigued by this idea that I understand that one might not fully understand some of the principles behind higher levels of academia and some of the processes that are gone through and some of the. But it sounds like people aren't coming with a basic kind of moral code. Is that a fair assessment of what you said? And if so, does that mean that the sort of earlier education / home environment isn't giving them that?
That might be a little more severe than I would put it. There might be an age factor. I mean, there might be a number of contributing factors around this. Do think we pay a lot more attention to academic integrity in higher education than we do in primary and secondary school. And among my colleagues, people who work in this field, we often think, well, should children get more training in their primary and secondary education? Well, obviously the answer is yes. But I mean, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, because we can't necessarily say to the teachers who are teaching kindergarten through what we would call in Canada grade 12, you should teach your students more about academic integrity, because the teachers themselves haven't been trained in how to teach academic integrity. I actually think that this starts in higher education, in teachers' college and teacher preparation programs. And it's in higher ed where we would say to aspiring teachers, look, this is part of your professional practice. And this is how you will, when you go into your own classrooms, think about academic integrity with your students relative to the grade level that they're in. So I actually think that higher education is responsible for developing the programs, because they're developing professionals who then go out in the workforce and enact integrity in a variety of ways in their professions. So I think it is actually incumbent upon higher ed. And should it start earlier, primary and secondary? Yes, but it should start even earlier than that in teacher preparation.
Is this something that is going to result? Did you see big bang to try and resolve some of these things, or is this a sort of slow drip feed and a move in the right direction? Because as you say, I mean, to pick up what you just said, this is human. What I find really interesting when we look at these themes is people talk about ethics as if we will impose ethics on this subset. We will get these people to behave more. And we know that there's a heck of a lot of process. It doesn't just happen because you wish it so. And there's human beings involved in this process. And so I'm fascinated by how does academia get itself into a better state given some of these dynamics?
That is the $1 million question, or the £1 million question, I'm sure you'd say. I'm not sure we have clear answers to this, but I think this whole crisis has allowed things to surface in terms of what are we doing wrong as a human society, right? And I think this has affected you in Europe and other parts of the world as well. We're having horrible stories come through here about the cracks in our healthcare system, right? Particularly with senior citizens in long-term care and the effect of this crisis on them. And it's one example of how are we failing as a society. And I think some of those questions are starting to come through in education. How are we failing as a society to provide our learners with the supports that they need to learn and learn ethically and learn responsibly? So are things like internet connectivity and limited access to technology going to become more fundamental questions around human rights? And I think that this whole crisis will surface questions about how do we do education ethically at every level, including industry training, because I think in some ways we've been able to get away with doing things because that's how we've always done them. And this crisis has shown us that that's no longer acceptable. And of course, conversations starting to happen around are pandemics going to be a new reality? People living through crises and emergencies. Is this going to be the only time? And I'm sure you've heard chatter in your circles as well, maybe not. And what does that look like? How will education and training have to shift if learning, teaching, living, working in emergency situations become more of a norm? And I'm not sure any of us have the answer to that, but I think those will become pressing questions as we move ahead.
One of the interesting things I've been sort of observing is this question around funding, and particularly if people are paying for education, and clearly there are some countries where the sums are much larger than others. But it's interesting, it's because on the face of it, you would sort of say, well, part of the reason that what I'm paying for is the ability to have a physical experience. And if I'm receiving that remotely, does that devalue this, or does it make me less willing to spend that much money? And of course, then you've got new competing propositions where online there are existing online training providers that they can't necessarily provide the certification, but it creates a slightly different landscape given what people are used to paying for. Are you seeing any sort of shifts in that space? Because that clearly is an ethical question as to what you should charge for something that is fundamentally different.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because different doesn't necessarily mean lower quality. Having said that, as we've made this rapid transition to remote learning, I'm sure that there's been an effect on the quality. I mean, that's fairly obvious because people haven't had a chance to, develop their remote learning programs. So yes, in the short term, the quality of education will have tanked, I'm sure. Over the long term, can we do better? Is it possible to provide quality educational experiences and training experiences in remote and online contexts over the long term? Yes. In terms of things like funding and student funding, I've seen the news reports out of Europe, and we've had similar ones here in North America where students have been experiencing extreme financial distress as a result of all of this. And should they have to continue to pay fees when they're not getting what they thought they were getting, and is it somehow unethical? I mean, the alternative, I suppose, one alternative reality would be that schools simply close. Which there's been some evidence of that happening in some jurisdictions, and then as they're closing, they're not giving students a refund. So it's a question of, do you want to try and continue to learn in some format? Are we all in this together, or shall we just close the doors and send you on your way? That I almost think that would be more unethical. I do think, by and large, educators, administrators, CEOs of training organizations are. I like to think, in general, people are trying to do the right thing. The question is, we don't necessarily know what the right thing is because there's no playbook for any of this. We might look back in 20 years and say, wow, we really botched that. But that will be something that we'll get through 2020 vision, I think, more so than we have today. So in terms of the financial stresses on students, they're obvious. And so are the financial stresses on organizations and the system at large.
Right. But I was struck by something you just said about the ethical questions and the answers not being known about for some time. The clarity as to what the right thing to do is. And I think that's a really interesting, broader societal question around what does good ethical behavior look like at the moment. And we can recognize it when we see it. There's extremities that are obvious, good and bad. But it's that middle ground of where there isn't necessarily an obvious, easy solution that doesn't involve someone somewhere making a potentially disproportionate sacrifice. That's quite an interesting challenge to deal with. And I thought, when coming into this conversation, I'd made a presumption that ethics in academia was sort of pretty clear cut. You'd have some straightforward issues and maybe some. Well, the picture you've just painted, it's a complicated picture. And if you've got this sort of lag, there is a risk that education and academia are blindsided slightly. If society moves in certain ways, and we've seen this with companies, that the oil companies is a good example, where you're doing something that's been fine for a long, long, long time, and suddenly something shifts, a Greta Thunberg type effect comes in, and suddenly what was acceptable no longer is. And that can happen very, very quickly. And I'm intrigued by this idea of the longevity of the ethical question that you posed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, and earlier on in our conversation today, you sort of asked about, what does educational or academic ethics involve? Academic integrity is one part of it. And as you were talking, you reminded me of the importance of research ethics in all of this, right? And the time lag and the development of research ethics, right, I think is relevant to the conversation because, most developed countries now will have things like institutional research ethics boards that will need to approve projects. And it's important, to think back to where did all that come from? I mean, now it's often tied to compliance. It's tied to funding. And if you want to get your funding, then you need to show that you're conducting your research with human or animal participants in ethical ways. Well, that all started out of the Nuremberg trials. And institutional research ethics boards are a direct result of the Nuremberg trials. And then that came to, we need research ethical oversight for medical experimentation. And then in the past, say, 30 years, that's expanded to social sciences, for example. In education, the field I work in now, we need ethical permission to conduct research with any human participants. But it was a result of that more than half a century ago that has driven our understanding and development of research ethics, and it continues to evolve. So I was I just wrote a paper on the ethical considerations in educational and social science research when we want to conduct research in languages other than English. Very few of the governing documents for institutional research ethics talk about when, say, my second language is Spanish. Say I wanted to work with Latin American immigrants to Canada, many of them will speak, say migrant workers from Mexico, right, who want to work on a farm here, and I want to go interview them for educational purposes. Well, they might not speak English. They might not understand what research ethics is all about. They might not understand the notion of informed consent. There's very little guidance provided in our national research ethics compliance body from the government, nor at our institutional level on how I should conduct that research ethically, taking into account the second language. And consistently, second and additional languages have been ignored in research ethics. So the paper that I just wrote was on why this is an area for further development, because that it's not been on anybody's radar, but we live in multilingual environments. In Europe, you've got plurilingual, contexts in which you work over there, and yet this remains basically an ignored concept in much of research ethics. So we're still developing, even though this stuff came out of the Nuremberg trials. We still have work to do.
Wow. That's very interesting, because I mean, there's two things. Obviously, there's the do they understand what you're saying, and then do they understand the concepts behind it? And so translation of words is one thing, and how do you but do they actually understand that idea? And I was speaking to another guest on this podcast who works in Istanbul. And so he was talking about some of the norms that exist in that world, and particularly fascinating parts of the world, because it's obviously the bridge between Europe and Asia. And he said, there's an interesting question there. What we view as a conflict of interest, they actually view potentially as being a risk management tool. So a good example would be if I work in a company and I get my brother to supply some goods, for me, that's a conflict of interest, or is a conflict that needs to be managed. Mm-hmm. And he was saying, in a Turkish perspective, it's the opposite, right? The way I guarantee that we get high quality supplies and don't get ripped off is I do business with people that have skin in the game that I can get to by other means. And so he said they don't, and it's not because they're trying to get around our rules, they just look at it very differently. And so I think that's, as you were talking there's a fascinating piece that sort of says they can hear the words, but do those concepts resonate in the way that they're intended to resonate, particularly if you've come from an environment where some of these dynamics aren't prevalent?
Very much so, right? And in research in higher education, for example, and beyond, one of the fundamental notions of informed consent in research is that individuals must have the right to withdraw, and they must understand that their participation is voluntary. So if you're doing research with people from other countries, and an academic or an official comes in and tells you you're participating in research, there is no voluntary nature to that research. You simply comply. But in Western context, research, it must be conducted in ways that are ethical. Consent must be informed, must be voluntary, must be ongoing. Those are the three criteria. Must be informed, voluntary, and ongoing. So if people don't understand that their consent is voluntary, that can shift their willingness or how they participate, right? And how do I communicate that in a way that makes sense for my prospective participants? We have that so far off our radar that sort of very few people are paying attention to that kind of thing, and yet we need to. I mean, if we say that we're conducting research in ethical ways, we need to extend it to language, to culture, to power dynamics, to all of that. To kind of circle back to your question around, what will we learn in hindsight? Well, we don't yet know, but we do know from other experiences that there can be these long-standing ripple effects, right? Like the effect of the Nuremberg trials on research ethics that's still being developed more than half a century later. And people like me who are doing research in this area are identifying new areas that continue to need further development. So it could be that this pandemic causes shifts that could have long-standing effects for decades in ways we can't yet predict.
Wow. That's amazing. I mean, the Nuremberg link it's so obvious now. Again, now you've pointed it out, it's obvious. As you were talking about sort of, some of the normal processes that apply, but I mean, one of the things clearly at the moment, there is a need to solve this problem, to deal with the COVID. And therefore, there is clearly a pressure on for scientists to crack on and find vaccines and tests. But it goes much broader than that, because there are other, there are behavioral scientists out there who may be able to help with government communications and how. So there's lots of academic disciplines that are serving a very useful purpose in terms of the fight to this. But clearly, Normally, when you bring drugs to market, when you do there's a whole load of processes you have to go through for precisely the reasons you've outlined. How is that disapplication of normal rules for sort of emergency purposes being looked at?
I'll give you an example from our institution at the University of Calgary. So I sit on the Research Ethics Board, and at our last board meeting, there was a call for volunteers. So we review the ethics applications that come in to accelerate the review of applications for research that's related to COVID-19. Because I work in social sciences, those are the kinds of applications I would review. And we would look at things involving, sociology, psychology, education, those disciplines. And the message that we got from the chair of our board was, look, we need an accelerated review of these applications, but that doesn't mean that there should be any less quality in terms of the review. So can you do it faster and dedicate the energy? So sort of, not push this off for 2 weeks because you've got other things. Can you prioritize it? But as you prioritize it, don't just push it through. Pay attention to the details, that the need for quality review was still important, even if the review was accelerated, so that we couldn't sacrifice speed for quality. Right. So that was kind of a key message from our school. And I don't know how other schools are handling it, but that's kind of a concrete example from one university and how we're responding, that the need to accelerate shouldn't mean that we are any less ethical in our conduct.
Right. So it's kind of like it would be this sort of crass example, but fast track security at an airport. So the same standards get applied. It's just that you'll pass through it more quickly because of the nature of the thing you're doing. Mm-hmm. But that's interesting because then presumably some other things are being deprioritized. So you're implicitly making an interesting ethical decision there, which makes perfect sense in the current context. But there'll be other things that will be lower down the list as a result. It's inevitable, but it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, it would be a reprioritization, right, of some of the work, but some of it would be time sensitive. So as an example, hypothetical example, say I'm an educational researcher and I would like to study the mental health effects of COVID-19 on teachers and students. Well, in order to conduct that research, I need to do it during COVID-19 if I want the real-time data. So yes, but you're right. The ethics of reprioritizing ethical applications for research is in itself an ethical question.
Look, we're running out of time, so thank you so much for taking me into all sorts of interesting places. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm really intrigued to see where you come out, and thank you so much for kind of clarifying some of these topics and giving me lots of other things to think about. It's been a really interesting exploration. So thank you so much for the research that you do, because I think it's the more I hear about it, the more I think it's really important. But secondly, thank you for appearing on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for the invitation.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Sarah for joining me and to you for listening. You can find out details of Sarah's research in the show notes. If this is your first time with the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe to it wherever you get your quality audio content. If you like the series, please do leave a review. It really helps other people to find the show and allows me to continue to attract high quality guests. I'll be back very soon with another episode in this series, but in the meantime, please stay safe, remember not to cheat in your exams, and thanks again for listening.